Welcome to Spiritual Steps, a podcast about learning to pray, listen, and grow by taking small steps on the spiritual journey. I'm your host, Stephen Hovatter, and this is episode 6, Praying the Psalms. Now, in this episode, I want to encourage you to pray through the Psalms and use them to connect with the Lord by connecting with this ancient set of prayers and poems. The Psalms have an unmatched place in the history of prayer. They stretch back into the Jewish roots of Jesus in the church, and there's evidence in the New Testament to what we would, of course, expect from where they come from, right? That both Jesus and the early church are deeply nourished by the Psalms. So the Gospels tell about 10 or 11 different times where Jesus quotes various Psalms, and some like in really significant moments of his ministry and his life, okay? As a whole, the New Testament, overall, it quotes Psalms altogether, like direct quotes, about 80 different times, okay? And there are over 300 allusions to the text, and that is an incredible amount. It's like way more than any of the other, books of the Old Testament. Now, part of that is because it's just a big book, right? Like there's 150 Psalms. It's a big chunkier Bible. But even beyond that, the rate at which these things are quoted is so frequent. They're just part, because of the way they were used in the life of, Jewish religious life of the day, the Jewish spirituality, they're just wrapped into the fabric of the way that people thought about God and what it meant to relate to God. Now, all that early influence that we see in like the New Testament is absolutely continued for most of the church's history. You have the continued use of the Psalms in the ordered prayer life of like monastics, okay? Where they're daily chanting through, huge portions of the Psalter, and on into like the Psalms' prominent place in most of the highly structured liturgical worship traditions. Okay, the Psalms, where you may have like a psalm almost every week or every week, and certainly in the prayer lives of untold numbers of disciples of Jesus. Like look through history and you listen to or read the lives of different saints and. I mean, the Psalms are just like all over their lips. I mean, their prayer lives, they're constantly in the Psalms, it seems like to me. I mean, it's pretty unscientific observation there, but I'm telling you that through the life of the church, people that excelled in prayer have often really immersed themselves into the Psalms. And after all, it kind of makes sense, right? Like if you want to learn to pray in the way of Jesus, how can you ignore these texts that have absolutely certainly molded his own prayer life that would have been part of the prayers that he learned in his home and in synagogue while he was growing up? The Psalms were just this kind of critical thing for the bedrock of our spirituality. Now, it's pretty simple. It's common advice for people who want to learn to pray to advise you, hey, go pray the Psalms, all right? That's something you may have heard before. And absolutely, that's what I'm doing here. I want to encourage you to go pray the Psalms because there's a lot of advantages for doing that. I mean, first of all, like working your way through the Psalms, praying one or two of them every day, it's a fantastic way of adding some kind of structure to your prayer life. A lot of people need that prayer, that kind of structure and, kind of flail without it. They don't know what to do without it. And so like for me, I've often used the Psalms as a way of beginning my prayers. So I'll start with a psalm, and then that maybe leads me. I'll kind of like pray through that for a little bit, and then I'll move into some more free and less structured form of prayer. More free form kind of thing after that. But here's the deal: the second reason that they can be very helpful is also something that's an obstacle. Okay, and so I don't want to just naively say, just go, wrap the Psalms in your prayer life. I want to kind of talk about this second thing a little bit because it's really important. See, sometimes people bump into the Psalms and they either thrive with them or they struggle with it because of this really multi-vocal nature of the Psalms. Like the Psalms speak from a lot of different places. Okay, what I mean by that is they provide this full spectrum of prayers. They're richly diverse in their emotional tone. So you have celebration next to lament. You have a desperate plea for salvation next to thankful gratitude. You'll have a celebration of God's justice and his royal power next to these questions about what the praying person is going to do in the face of their enemies. Okay, so sometimes the Psalms offer just what you might expect, and they offer like a warm and a reassuring like voice of wisdom. This kind of pastoral tone. But then other times the Psalms, you just open them and they attack you like with this vengeful fury. It's kind of like shocking fury sometimes. That diversity of their voices, the tones that Psalms contains, is both a great asset and it's a formidable obstacle. And so I want to offer what I think is a helpful framework for dealing with that diversity, because I think it'd be useful to you without derailing you too much. I want it to be useful to you without derailing you too much. But, on the other side, maybe a little derailing isn't totally a bad thing either. And we'll get to that in a minute. So Walter Brueggemann, a very well-respected Old Testament scholar, wrote a book called Praying the Psalms. And one of his observations that I think is really useful is that the Psalms can be read with this like threefold framework in mind. Okay, and what he says, he wants to note that there are movements of the spiritual life that are orientation, disorientation, and reorientation. And he says those are common movements in our faith life. That we are securely oriented in the world, and we get our bearings and our equilibrium by coming to what seems to be, to us, a very reasonable way of thinking about God, the way the world works. It's the way the world should work. It's kind of the common track, I guess. And so that's orientation, right? And then at some point we experience like painful disorientation as the thing that we reasonably expected, the orienting factor for us, the thing that is normally and accepted as completely true, it gets yanked out from under you, and it gets yanked out from under us, and we scramble to make sense of what that means, right? We just kind of feel lost and disoriented and spinning. And then sometimes there are movements that are surprising reorientation, where kind of out of the blue some moment of grace comes or something else, and you come to a more nuanced, a more deeply true way of seeing the Lord and understanding your own experience and how all that works together. And these three things, I mean, I'm kind of spelling them out as if they're linear, and I don't know if that's necessarily what Brueggemann intends or not, but my experience is that all three of these things kind of happen at different times, and they kind of come back and forth. You move back and forth between orientation and disorientation and reorientation, commonly throughout the spiritual life. Now, I think Brueggemann's great insight here is that there are indeed Psalms that speak to people in all of those places. Okay, this is a really useful framework for reading the Psalms. So you take a Psalm like Psalm 1, and it speaks to the world as we think it should be, indeed, like it often is. They're good people who are doing right, and they meditate on the law of the Lord, and those people are they're going to flourish and they're going to be fruitful. And then on the other hand, you have wicked people who are going to suffer consequences for the foolishness that's driving their lives. And that makes sense, right? Like that's the way things ought to be. And that's kind of all that Psalm 1 has to say about it, right? Okay, that this is the way that the world is. And then you have a psalm like Psalm 88, which really looks around and angrily blames God for the experience of pain that has come despite his prayers, his crying out to God. I mean, it's the prayer of someone who, for whom the common wisdom, it just doesn't seem right. The world isn't working like it should. Okay, and the result is this brutally honest and raw prayer. It's like crying out to God in protest for something, for the world to be made right. Okay, so that's Psalm 88. That's like a prayer of disorientation, like things aren't like they should be. And then you have a psalm like Psalm 103, and Psalm 103 is going to speak both of the reality of suffering and kind of acknowledge that, but it's also going to speak about the Lord's sure and certain vindication in the face of that suffering. It's a psalm that has the voice of someone who has experienced something really wrong in the world, but who sees that the Lord has either made it right already or will in the future. And that's a psalm of reorientation, right? It's a psalm of there is brokenness. It acknowledges the reality of that, but then has this other grace-oriented reality on the other side of it. Now, so you take all those things, and those are just three psalms. But like, if you kind of read the psalms with that framework, you start seeing like seeing them all over the place. There are all kinds of psalms that fit into the model of there's some of them are orientation, but many psalms are disorienting or psalms of disorientation and psalms of reorientation. It seems like the bulk of the psalms I think fit in those two categories, although with some of the others thrown in. That emotional tone, the range of those emotional tones in the psalms, from the experience of confident orientation to painful disorientation and then towards surprising reorientation, that range can be jolting when you read through these poems. Okay, that's why I think it could be like maybe a little naive, just say, well, just pray through the Psalms, But, you have to be prepared for that. You have to know that that's kind of what you're going to get into. Every psalm is not going to speak to exactly where you're at. That's not necessarily what they're trying to do. What they are great for, is they can help you if you kind of consistently pray through them. They can form you. They can help your prayers form you in preparation for the kinds of twists and turns that are going to take place in your life, which are absolutely going to be jolting in and of themselves. So, the prayers aren't just, paint by numbers. If you have this sort of situation, pray this kind of prayer, although maybe there's some of that can be helpful too. But if you kind of learn the discipline of praying through all of them, and even when you're in a time of your life where you're fairly oriented, you're also praying through these psalms of disorientation, then you can kind of be prepared for that moment of disorientation that comes. Or if you're in a moment of disorientation and you're praying one of the psalms of reorientation, then it can help you kind of see the light that may be on the end of the tunnel, even while your protest is made real and validated by the other psalms. Okay, so taken as a whole, the psalms, they really undercut the idea of prayer as being this univocal one tone thing, that it's only going to be polite, pleasant speech towards God. And instead, the Psalms, they prepare the way for this gritty spirituality that can take whatever life throws at it. And they help people relate to God with prayers that can flow out of, all the different kind of moments of life, right? So when you're in one of these different phases or these movements, then the prayers that make sense in that kind of movement will not just be foreign to you, but they'll come naturally because they've been formed in you through the Psalms. So let me encourage you, as naively as it may be, let me encourage you to do the hard work and make the Psalms a part of your prayer life. Maybe take a season and pray through a psalm a day just at the beginning of your time with the Lord. You can do that and be done with it before half the year is out. Or maybe one way I've used them is to take a single psalm and pray through it for a week, and then the next Sunday, you pick up, you turn to the next psalm, and every day that week you pray through the same one, so you can kind of develop a little bit of familiarity with the psalms as you go. And as you do that, either way, however you decide to do it, you see, pay attention and listen for those tones, the tones of orientation, disorientation, reorientation that occur in this ancient prayer poetry, and then start paying attention as you perceive those movements and perhaps those tones in your own walk and in your own prayers before the Lord. So that's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. You can catch up with me on Twitter at the handle @StephenHovatter. It's linked in the show notes. There's also a link to my other podcast, which is called The Craft of Ministry, for any of my colleagues out there leading in different ways across the church. If you have some feedback for this podcast, let me know. It's been really neat to hear from people who have found this helpful. And if that's true for you, tell you what, I'd love for you to also spread the word. One way you can do that is by submitting the review on iTunes. You have time, I'd appreciate it. And also, please remember to subscribe in your app of choice, however you listen to these podcasts, whether it's iTunes or Overcast or whatever it is. And we'll tell you what, we'll see you with a new episode next week. Until then, keep taking the next step that you see in front of you, and may God be with you on each and every step of your journey. Peace.